Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and for this evening's program, we have with us Mr. Arthur Deakin from America's Markets Intelligence. Sir, welcome to our program, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kiana. Very happy to be here.
Great. So before we head into tonight's program, I'd be delighted if you can share with our viewers and our listeners just a little bit about your company and how long you've been in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, America's Market Intelligence, which we call AMI for short, we're based here in Miami, Florida, in the United States, and we've been operating in the region since 1993, so over 30 years now.
Okay.
And we've done mostly engagements in the natural resources sector, so including energy and mining, but also payments and logistics and healthcare. And the essential focus of the firm is to help foreign companies, for the most part, not only enter into the region, but successfully expand in the region.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And we'll head into tonight's discussion. And I'd like to start a little bit on the reflective side COVID-19 pandemic and how it has affected the oil and gas industry. Arthur, and if I may, and you may also call me Kiana going forward, we've seen the blows delivered to the industry by the COVID-19 pandemic, and Guyana is among many of the countries that have been fortunate to remain standing in its offshore projects. What are some of the key reasons you believe the country was able to survive some of the toughest parts of the storm last year, and how do you see 2021 panning out for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we saw across the board in the oil sector
Mm-hmm.
and gas as well is a large write-off of many of the lower quality assets among the big oil companies. So that includes assets that perhaps are emit more carbon emissions, or perhaps have a higher break-even cost, or even those projects that are in some riskier jurisdictions with political instability or regulatory, lack of clarity in that sense. So Guyana, as well as Brazil in the region, they both have a lot of high quality oil. And what I mean by high quality is it's a sweet crude oil that is lower in sulfur content, and is something that is growing in demand globally, but especially in China, who is importing massive amounts of that type of oil. So both Brazil and Guyana that have this type of oil, in addition to their low break-even costs, lower than $40 a barrel. Guyana, I think, is 35 for the phase one
Yes.
exploration, and that price is supposed to go down to $25 in the phase two exploration. So those factors combined with the appeal for for high quality crude is something that has allowed Guyana to come out somewhat on top of this pretty bad situation.
Okay. And how do you see 2021 panning out for us?
Yeah, 2021, expect the growth and demand for this high quality sweet crude to keep growing. Um, China is really ramping up infrastructure and construction efforts to revive its economy, and it's definitely doing a good job so far. So the demand for this type of oil is going to keep growing, especially as stricter environmental regulations are passed. I forgot to mention that a main reason towards the switch towards this sweeter crude was that the International Maritime Organization passed a law that reduced emissions by up to 80% in ships. So that was a big reason behind that shift, and that shift is permanent. So 2021, I expect a good year. I expect oil prices to uh, stay around the price where they are, or grow a little bit We see commitment by some of the major producers to restrict output until there's greater certainty on oil demand around the world. So the panorama is positive.
Thank you very much for that perspective. And I'd like to sort of link that to the next question, where we have a greater commitment from many countries now in terms of the transition to renewables. And because of this transition, there are many stakeholders in the industry who've been saying that Guyana, as a result, has a very narrow window within which to develop the multitude of resources that it has out there and to also explore the potential that it has in the Stabroek Block and in other offshore areas. So, considering that, what are your thoughts on this perspective that we have this narrow time frame, narrow window? And if you can, would you put a time frame to that? Would it be 40 to 50 years?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to do, put a time frame for that. But I definitely don't think that people should take the narrow warning, too literal. I think it definitely there's this transition towards renewable energy, which is important for the environment and just a cleaner world. But I don't expect oil demand to have peaked, as some projections have made that demand has peaked already. I don't believe that's the case. I think that renewable energy needs to have a mix of a firm base, and that comes either from gas power plants or diesel fueled power plants, or even coal in some places. But we're not yet at the place in terms of having the adequate battery technology and storage regulation to have grids run 100% on renewable energy. We've seen that be a problem just now in Asia, where there's been a prolonged period of cold, and there hasn't been enough energy to supply this cold front. And if they were based solely on renewable energy, most definitely, if there wasn't proper storage in place, there would be a lack of supply there. So it's important to have a mix of both renewable and a firm base. So I think that the short answer is I don't think that the narrow time frame is that narrow. I think 50 years probably is a good panorama for that. And countries like Guyana and Brazil that have higher quality oil are likely to be the last ones to be affected by this energy transition. I think those are the ones that will be prioritized, as we've seen already, and will benefit from this.
That's an interesting perspective that you've put forward there, Arthur, because there's a lot of literature now that the demand for oil has actually peaked. We've seen BP actually put out a report where they sort of predicted that the demand for oil is actually going to go down even more as we see this transition. But it would be interesting for us if you can just outline some of the other reasons why you believe that the demand has not peaked as yet. Are you saying that because the infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure that's needed to support renewables and actually implementing that across the board, that you're still going to see that need for the demand for oil?
Yeah, I would say that that's part of it. We're not. There's some countries where yes, we already have that regulatory
Yes.
framework and technology available at a certain price that make renewable energy economically makes sense. You see that in some countries in Europe and in the US to a certain extent. But there's a lot of countries where that technology is just not available at feasible prices because these countries have to import these panels from China or the wind turbines from China as well, or other places, some places in Europe. But So that's part of it. But the other reason is that I believe that the the economic growth of the world and the global GDP, sort of say, is going to keep growing as the population grows, as we become, you know, even more of a consumer economy. I think that the demand for oil is going to increase in conjunction with that. So I think
Okay.
until we reach sort of a plateau in terms of population, that oil consumption is going to continue to grow. Of course, there is the other side of electric vehicles and technologies that are more energy efficient, and that's of course decreases the demand for oil. But then again, I don't think we're there yet. If you look at, I'm Brazilian, and when you walk in the streets there, you don't see any electric vehicles. You know, electric vehicles right now are sort of a rarity in developing markets, and it's much more common in the United States or in wealthier areas. So I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn your attention to local content, and I know that this is something you've written on quite a lot last year, where Guyana is concerned. And in one of your pieces, which you focused on Guyana, you said that a clear path on the way forward is needed, and that Guyana should ensure that whatever rules it's putting its place, it doesn't find itself in a position where it's biting off more than it could chew. I'd be grateful if you can give us just some more color on this sort of cautionary statement. Why did you choose to make that particular statement, and were you drawing from lessons experienced from other countries?
Yeah, I that's definitely an important aspect of Guyana's oil development, this local content rule.
Yes.
Um, I think that, you know, what Guyana needs is something that's a law that is constantly evolving, in the sense that it has certain clauses that adjust accordingly to the sector, the level of development in the sector. In some countries like Brazil, we've seen in the past that the original local content rules for its pre-salt oil production had disproportionate fines for noncompliance, and even bottlenecks that hurt the construction of FPSOs. So if you don't have a local content that can adjust to the development of the sector, that you know, it is sort of stuck in the past, that's going to hinder the growth at the appropriate speed of the sector. So that's kind of what I mean by that. That you need something that is adequate to the situation, and I think that Guyanese participation is vital for the growth not only of the sector but the growth of the country in conjunction. But right now, as it stands, Guyana doesn't have even the volume to address one FPSO. So I think that as many of these come online, what Guyana still needs is proper training for its citizens. It needs more resources invested in educating its citizens regarding the oil sector. So I think it's more of a gradual transition that's necessary there.
Great. Thank you for that. If I understand you correctly, we definitely have to ensure that we are not too ambitious with the rules or the guidelines that we put in place given the capacity that we have at this point in time. So,
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say, you know, ambition is essential to grow for anyone.
mhm,
I think it's just what's needed is something that's realistic to the situation. You know,
gotcha.
you can't have, you know, this is a random example, but you can't have a country, say a country has 100,000 citizens, you can't expect them to produce the same GDP as a country with 1 million citizens. You know, it's got to be respective to the resources on the ground.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I'd just like to ask one more question on the local content front. Now,
Absolutely.
what provisions, or if you can recommend at least one provision that we should ensure we have in place, which would ensure citizens do benefit to the maximum extent possible from the sector?
Yeah, I think that one that is rather simple, and something that is important to include is a certain threshold, a certain minimum of local contracting that's required in the oil and gas development. So, that number still has to be defined. I've seen figures saying 20%, but I don't think it's been defined yet. But having that minimum threshold and having a clear definition of what local contracting entitles, if it's direct contracting or indirect, that's also important. But I think that having a threshold is and writing it into law, right? I think that's important.
Great. Now, let's turn to some matters that are more connected to broader development. You would have noticed that I'm sure there is a huge debate here on bringing gas to shore. Now, based on your experience, do you believe that this is a project we should proceed with? And if yes, what steps do you believe we ought to take to ensure it is financially sound?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that the gas to shore project is something that would be beneficial for Guyana, and to give a little bit of context why I say that, I've seen that the electricity tariffs in Guyana range between 25 to 35 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's one of the highest electricity costs in the region. So, that is something that hinders business development. It discourages multinationals from establishing operations there. So, this is the reason why it's so expensive is because Guyanese businesses rely on generators that use diesel, which is
Mm-hmm.
very expensive, and aren't as effective in terms of producing energy. So that high cost is something that could be reduced with this gas to shore power plant. Um, that's something that studies have been conducted that show that the prices could be halved, or even cut even greater than that with this proper, if this gas to shore project comes online. Of course, finding the right split between government investment and Exxon's investment in this plant is important. I know there's works being conducted on that, finding the proper split between who will put what kind of money. But since in the extraction of oil, you have this associated natural gas already, you might as well put it to good use. And with the large electricity losses in Guyana, the high electricity tariffs, it makes economic sense to have this gas to shore power plant.
Great. Now, to the other aspect of the question, ensuring that we make it financially sound, how would you say what steps we should be taking in that regard?
Yeah. So I think that part of it has already started, which is the very thorough and independent studies to figure out what makes sense in terms of development of the project. Um, Making sure those are conducted by an independent organization is very important. I think that using existing infrastructure already in place for the oil extraction, being able to take advantage of any of that for transporting the gas, that's also going to be huge in making it economically viable. And then just having proper financing, either from the government or Exxon or even some other private investors, that will encourage the capitals in place for the development of this gas to shore project.
Thank you very much. Now, there's another matter that I know that you would have written on, and that is the importance of economic diversification. Sir, how critical do you believe this is for Guyana? And given the climate, the circumstances we're living in right now, is diversification even an option for us anymore? Is it something that we just can't say, well, okay, you know what? Maybe it's an option. Is this just the way that we have to go towards?
Yeah, no, I think diversification is always an option. Those people that say it's we don't have the resources, they're not focusing on the future, because the worst thing that Guyana can do is spend all its resources and all its attention in the oil and gas and forget the sugar industry, forget the mining industry, forget the fishing industry. Those sectors are vital for the development of society as a whole. It employs a lot of people in Guyana, and it's a livelihood of many families in the country. So, failing to address those sectors would be a grave mistake. So, I definitely don't think it's too late, and I think that that's the way forward.
Excellent. Now, before we continue, we'll go to a quick commercial break, and when we return, be examining some more issues in the oil and gas sector in Guyana.
Kaieteur Radio, keeping you informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Heartbeats, grab someone special, relax, and turn up your radio for Heartbeats with DJ Viper every Thursday night from 21 hours to 22 hours 30, giving you only the best mix of Indian love music. Heartbeats only on Kaieteur Radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now watching us or joining us, wherever you are, this is a special edition of Guyana's Oil and You. We have with us Mr. Arthur Deakin from the America's Market Intelligence, and what we're discussing tonight are just a range of topics that relate to the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affected Guyana's oil and gas industry and the way forward for 2021. We would have examined the transition to renewables and Guyana's narrow window and the time frame that is perceived for us to transition as well. We would have also discussed just a little bit on local content and some of the provisions that are needed to ensure we're successful with a policy and supporting law. So, Arthur, we're now going to get into the final two questions on our show this evening, and they relate to the issues of transparency and accountability. Sir, we have seen many recent incidents of countries losing billions of dollars in oil revenue to corruption. What specifically would you say Guyana should do to ensure it stays clear of this pitfall?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question. I think that the approval of the National Resource Fund was a good start for the management of the oil resources. As most of you know, it created a New York Federal Reserve account for the oil deposits, and it has some good controls. The problem is that there are certain things outlined in the Act that have not yet been implemented. This includes the creation of an investment committee. There's the creation of a public oversight and accountability committee, and the creation of a macroeconomic committee that all haven't been established yet. Having the creation of those entities is going to be essential to ensure proper spending of the resources. I think another red flag was that the Office of the President announced last year that they were going to have direct oversight over the country's finances and natural resources. And I think that's a mistake. I think to ensure transparency and avoid any political coercion of sorts, it's vital for ministries to have a certain level of independence from the cabinet. The current structure of the fund allows the Minister of Finance to have final say on how the monies are spent. And the ministry also appoints the members of those investment
Yes.
committees that I mentioned earlier. This gives too much control to the current administration, and not enough independent oversight. So I think what it comes down to is proper regulatory and fiscal framework and oversight. That's what's essential to avoid disastrous consequences down the line.
So, in your view, Guyana definitely needs to change the current model, the regulatory model that it has, where the politicians sort of have this strong oversight or strong hand in the way the oil and gas sector is going to be managed.
Yes, I think there's room for improvement. I wouldn't say that all of the law is bad. There's definitely some parts that are positive, and there's certain controls that are in place to ensure the proper spending of that monies. But right now, it's too tied to the politics, and that's not a good sign for future development.
Thank you very much for that. And my final question before we go to your concluding remarks: what are sort of two or three countries that you would say Guyana should look at in terms of best practices for being successful with the management of its oil and gas resources?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd like to focus in the region because that's where we work on the most. I think Brazil is a great lesson. Brazil has had a lot of problems with corruption with Petrobras, its
Yes.
state-owned oil company. So Brazil shows examples of what not to do,
Okay.
and that's something that Guyana should definitely look at. But it also shows the ability um, to really capitalize on the resources it has. Brazil has done a great job in its pre-salt exploration. It exported record amounts to China last year, even though it was a pandemic. So I think Brazil has some positives that Guyana could learn from. I wouldn't say it's 100% bulletproof model, but there are things that Guyana could learn from them. Brazil also has a very good regulatory and mature framework for its energy sector. So that's another positive development. And then the other country in the region, although it's a little bit, less in scale and a little bit newer in terms of oil development, I think Colombia is also a good country of reference. They also have a very good regulatory framework. It's very mature, and it has the proper controls that allow for responsible spending of the resources that come from natural resources. So Colombia is sort of a newer example that Guyana could look at.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, sir. And I now invite you to provide your concluding thoughts on Guyana's performance and how you see it along the industry as a performer.
Yeah, I think that when there's so much oil being found and there's so much money to be made, I think everyone gets a little bit frantic, and a little bit nervous that things are going to go wrong, that money is going to be stolen. I think that's very important to have, as a point of focus. You need to ensure transparency. You need to ensure that the controls are in order to avoid any corruption and mismanagement of resources. But it's something that people also have to have patience. It takes time to develop an oil and gas sector. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of cooperation between all the stakeholders in the private sector, between the government, between the Starbrek consortium as well. It's something that it's an ongoing negotiation and development. And what Guyana has to its advantage is that it has over 100 years of history of previous precedents that it can learn from. So it doesn't have to start from zero like many of the other countries
Hmm.
that found oil 20 or 30 years ago. They have a lot of examples of what has worked and hasn't worked. So using that to their advantage and and capitalizing on this great wealth that they have found, it can really transform Guyana into, another country, and that will be beneficial to everyone involved, to the oil companies, of course, but also to the citizens, which is the most important thing at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for your insightful contributions to the program this evening. I do hope that we can have you back soon for further discussions on matters that are relevant to the sector.
Absolutely. It was great being here. Have a good night.
Have a good night to you too. To our viewers on Facebook Live and those tuning in via Kaieteur Radio 99.1 and 99.5 FM, we thank you for your usual support. And those of you who perhaps caught the program late, not to worry, as there will be a rebroadcast tomorrow at 11 p.m. Until then, do enjoy the rest of your evening.